Okay, our goal today is to write a strong body paragraph. Now, when I read through about 15 essays and I gave very detailed um, feedback. And what I noticed after going through those 15 was that overall introductions and conclusions were strong, but the actual body of the paragraph, of the essay, the body paragraphs, which is the most important part, were filled with mistakes. And I have to just blame myself on that one for not properly teaching it. So that's what I want to do today. I want to teach you how to write a strong body paragraph. Now, the way I'm going to do this is by going over some of the major problems I saw in your papers. I've created some examples that I've seen in your papers that make it either, make the body unclear and often disorganized and not, it makes, and where you don't have strong claims. So, first problems I noticed were people, now this wasn't everyone, but many people didn't start off their paragraphs with claim sentences. So you were missing claim sentences. Another thing is I would see quotes that were not correctly written. And then I would see, this is probably one of the biggest ones, and this is something I didn't emphasize enough, and that is quotes were not relevant to the claims. And so that's what I want to go over. I want to show you an example where all three of these mistakes takes place. So you can read right here. First, according to page 122 of the text, quote, he screamed and threw himself sideways, taking the inner wall of the shelter, he screamed and clawed out of the shelter and ran to the shore of the lake. Stumbling and tripping, he scrambled into the water and slammed his head back and forth, trying to waste his eyes, slashing at the water to clear his eyes. Brian didn't feel sorry for himself after he was sprayed, but rather washed his eyes. Now, probably the first glaring mistakes you noticed were problems in the quote, like trying to waste his eyes. It should have been wash, and then it just seems to kind of stop here. So that means that the quote was not written correctly. Some people did not copy correctly. So if we're not copying correctly, that's what we call. That's just an example of being lazy. Really, you're not double checking. You're not reading what you've already written to see if it makes sense and uh, if it has all the words that you copied from the book. Easy fix. Don't be lazy. But the biggest thing is when I read this paragraph, I have a vague idea. I know what's going on because I've read the book, but if I hadn't read the book, I'd have no idea what you're talking about here. Because, first of all, there's no information about what's going on, who's spraying him. And that's because we don't have a claim sentence. It goes first and then it just goes right into the evidence. There is no claim. Remember, we have claim, evidence, justification, CEJ. But you got to start off with a claim, and so the claim sentence should be, in this case, first, he showed resilience after being sprayed by the skunk. And then it's done. You got a claim sentence. Now this makes more sense. But then here's the next problem. This quote is not relevant to the claim. What this quote is telling me is how he reacted to getting sprayed by the skunk. It's telling me that when the skunk sprayed him, he freaked out. Well, guess what? Everybody would freak out if they got sprayed by a skunk, even cowards, even people that were not resilient. So this quote does not show me that he's resilient. So I'm going to replace it now with a quote that will. I think this is page 123. So now I've changed it, and look at this quote. According to page 123 of the text, The basic idea had been good, the place for his shelter was right, but he just hadn't gone far enough. He had been lazy. But now he knew the second most important thing about nature, what drives nature. Food was first, but the work for the food went on and on. Nothing in nature was lazy. He had tried to take a shortcut and paid for it with his turtle eggs, which he had come to like more than chicken eggs from the store. They had been fuller somehow, had more depth to them. So that's the end of the quote. And then it goes here. Now the justification says Brian did not feel sorry for himself after he was sprayed, but rather washed his eyes. And then we want to add and began to rebuild his shelter. So that, and actually I'm going to say washed his eyes, learned from his mistakes, and began to rebuild his shelter. Now, one more thing I need to add to this. According to page 123 of the text, where it says the basic idea had been good, this is a context problem. It just starts to talk about something without giving me any information about what it's talking about. The basic idea had been good. What idea? And it says the place for a shelter was right. So I need to give some information so that this quote makes sense when I read it by giving background information. So I'm going to say, according to page 123 of the text, after being sprayed by a skunk and washing his face, Brian thought, quote, I'm going to say thought that, quote, that the basic idea had been good, and now it makes sense because I gave a nice little piece of background information that would transition into the quote. We're going to talk about this again right here. So this is the biggest problem I would see. Quotes that were not relevant to the claim, and quotes that did not have context. Also justifications that were not detailed. Let's read this one. Finally, Brian showed resilience. On page 147, he said to himself, I might be hit, but I'm not done. When the light comes, I'll start to rebuild. I still have the hatchet, and that's all I had in the first place. Brian could have fallen into self-pity at this point, but he didn't. Now, what is he talking about when he says, I might be hit, but I'm not done? What hit him? You see, I need context, background information. So this statement was said right after the tornado hit. So I can just go back to my claim and say Brian showed resilience after the tornado destroyed his shelter. On page 147, and I'm going to say this, after looking at the damage, let's do this. On page 147, after looking at the damage, he said to himself, I might be hit, but I'm not done. When the light comes, I'll start to rebuild. I still have the hatchet, and that's all I need. In the first place, Brian could have fallen into self-pity at this point, but he didn't. So my justification is the next issue. It's not very detailed. What I would want to do here is maybe add some more sentences or get more specific about why this is resilient. This is a good start. Brian could have fallen into self-pity at this point, but he didn't. Instead, he assessed the situation and kept a positive attitude by realizing that he was in a better situation at this point than he was after the tornado. After the plane crash. He had self-confidence. He had the self-confidence that he could survive, period. A much more detailed response. And um, finally, I would have things like this, where the evidence and the justifications don't relate to the claim. So, Brian was prudent by learning to become one with nature. He showed this on page 70, which said, quote, "The bear made no move to hurt you, to threaten you. It stood to see you better, study you, then went on its way eating berries. It was a big bear, but it did not want you, did not want to cause you harm, and that is the thing to understand here. Although Brian has been living outdoors for some time, only in this part of the book does he start to truly communicate with nature and to identify with the creatures of the natural world. Furthermore, he begins to see his new shelter as a home. Well, this evidence and justification has nothing to do with prudent. Prudent means being able to think ahead and be careful. This is telling me that he's become one with nature. So again, made some of the most common mistakes: missing claim sentences, quotes not written correctly, quotes that are not relevant, not giving context for quotes, background information, giving justifications that are not detailed, and evidence and justifications that don't relate to the claim. Look at your body, the body of your paragraph, of your essay. Look at the body paragraphs of your essay and see if you made any of these mistakes. I'm betting you probably did, based upon the 15 that I looked at. Also, the most common mistake I saw was not providing context for the quote. The second most common mistake I saw was quotes that were not relevant to the claim. If you're going to talk about the skunk incident or the moose incident, the fact that he got beat up is not relevant to why he's resilient. It's his response to getting attacked. It's his reaction to getting attacked that shows that he's resilient. So you'll need to find those quotes and replace them, replace the incorrect quotes with relevant quotes.